Some of you may have been shocked by the revelation that I used to be a pastor. Me too. I joke that I was God's practical joke on hell, and then after the punchline, I was called to leave, and I joke that I used to get paid to be good, and now I'm just good for nothing. So. I wanted to open, with a little levity, just as a way to introduce actually a request for prayer. We opened with the first words in the letter that Paul writes to the church in Rome, it's essentially what I was originally scheduled to kind of teach on, and then the weather happened, and we're trying to consolidate schedules, and wanted to finish the teaching series that Russ was leading us through up to this, and so kind of consolidated the whole chapter into one message. So all that to say, there's a lot here that I'm not going to talk about, or that I could pull out from the first half of the letter that we just listened to. I'll make brief commentary, but then there's, as fate would have it, the last half of the letter is probably the most difficult and most uncomfortable passage that someone could be assigned to teach, and falls on me this morning. So I would just pray that I would ask that you pray for me, that I would be faithful and that I would be careful. So, Lord, in Isaiah, you say that it is the one who is humble and contrite in spirit and that trembles at your word that you turn toward. I pray that we would be those sorts of people this morning. Through Jesus Christ, amen. My wife told me I had to include art. So in 1907, an Austrian painter named Gustav Klimt finished a painting that would become one of the most recognized paintings in the world. It's actually like in the top 3 most reproduced and recognized paintings, along with the Mona Lisa and Starry Night. The original title was Lovers. It has since been better known as The Kiss. Yeah, I don't know if it's up there or not. Maybe you'll get to see it. Most of you probably have seen it. But in it, there's 2 figures, and they kneel at the edge of this high cliff, or mountaintop as it were. And the man is leaning in, cradling the woman's face. Her eyes are closed, and she's gently holding his face. And they're wrapped in gold, shimmering like almost heavenly gold, as if the universe has draped them in glory. And the world behind them simply just fades away. Everything about them, their posture, the gravity, is directed towards this passion. And you can marvel at it, and many do. And this has actually become the anthem of cultures in Western culture. In many ways, still. Because if you realize what you're looking at, you realize this isn't just a painting about 2 lovers. You're actually looking at a picture of worship. And not in the narrow sense of singing songs and hymns and spiritual songs, but in the deepest sense of what 2 individuals are turning their hearts and souls and passions towards. The thing that gets your attention, that gets your face. The thing in which everything around your life arranges itself. That's what most people don't know about this, is that this wasn't the end of his exploration of this outlook on life. A few years later, he took the same couple in the same embrace with the same gold and the same orientation, and he placed them inside a larger work called the Tree of Life. And it's a triptych like used in Byzantine churches, where he got the inspiration and where he borrowed the gold. And its triptych is labeled in three titles: expectation, which is the woman on the left, the longing, the expectation, the hope, and then the tree of life connecting heaven and earth in the middle. And what he identifies as the couple's embrace is fulfillment. See, for Klimt, that was his salvation story. That was his gospel. That was his belief. And it really revolves around and expresses what he worshiped. See, he wasn't a Christian. He was never married. He fathered roughly 14 children by various models and mistresses. And he was part of the Vienna Succession, which was a movement that deliberately painted what polite society thought ought not to be painted. And he was deliberately rejecting the Victorian morality that he felt that religion was imposing and holding them back from that which was truly life. See, here, the tree of life, like the church, is just something that's ornamental. It's something that's in the background, but it's not where life is found. He was a slave to his passions, and his mistresses and wives and numerous children were the consequence of his misorientation or his disorientation in regards to where life and meaning is found. And center in the tree is the messenger of death, the black bird, kind of indicating almost a prophetic word from this symbol, the tree of life, which from Genesis to Revelation is the center symbol. We're going to return to this in a little bit, but I wanted to introduce this because this is the central theme that Paul introduces in the beginning of this book. And the question for us as we open this series and begin to open our lives and maybe try to reorient ourselves towards the words and the ways of Jesus is, what are we turned towards? What has our face? What has our devotion? What do we value? What do we drape gold over? Paul's going to argue with breathtaking precision, really, over these 16 chapters, that the direction of your worship will determine the direction of your life. That whatever you're turned towards, that your direction will determine your destination. That whatever you use to orient yourself to life and meaning and worth and value and happiness and how to deal with sadness and shame and grief, that compass will either lead you to salvation or it will lead you to despair. Get the orientation right and everything falls in place. Get it wrong, aim your life at anything other than God, and everything from your mind to your body to your relationships to culture begins to unravel. See, Paul is going to start with the presumption, a given in his argument, that we all will worship. It's not a question of will or will you not worship. The question is, what will you worship? Now, some, I know when you go, oh, we're going to study the letter to the book of Romans, most of you, there's probably people in this room who think, what does this have to do with like the time in which we live, right? Like that generation gap that always happens where the youth always wonder what the old heads are so up in arms about. They're out of touch. They just don't understand. So the illustrations that Paul uses were contemporary, but they may not they don't seem modern or contemporary to us. They were contemporary to his culture. But so he talks about idols and temples, and we talk about Instagram. He talks about the honor and shame society in Rome, and instead of our cancel culture, he talks about ancient sexual ethics, and we talk about modern liberated sexual identity. But the underlying premise hasn't really changed in a couple thousand years since he wrote it, because the human condition hasn't changed. What makes life meaningful? How do I know that I matter? What's the definition of human flourishing? Where do I find identity, meaning, value, and worth? What is the definition of beauty? What is the definition of love? What do I do with my guilt, my shame, my pain? See, these are timeless topics. And Paul, as he walks through his letter to the church in Rome, is going to address all of those things in ways that can still serve and minister to us today. And so before we start digging into the last half of the chapter, you'll notice in the opening that we just read, Paul's stated objective of writing this letter for them and our stated objective for studying his words is in 1:5. He says, after his creed, there's the Apostles' Creed that many of you may have learned or know from church attendance or growing up in church. This is the Apostles' Paul Creed that he opens with. And at the end of that creed, he says, the reason that we believe and do this is that we've received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the name's sake of God. To bring about the obedience of faith. And I would just submit to you, this week would be something to worth meditating on and thinking about is, what does that mean? What is the obedience of faith? What is disobedience of faith? When he closes the letter, he uses the same phrase. This is Paul's frame for his literary painting. The frame by which he frames his whole argument is around that phrase. In his benediction, in his doxology at the end, in 16:26, he says, to him who's able to strengthen you according to my gospel and the preaching of Jesus, according to the revelation that has now been disclosed, to bring about the obedience of faith. To the wise God be glory forever through Jesus. Amen. So the orientation that we're supposed to have as we enter in and reflect upon this, that's supposed to be in the back of our minds, is how does this bring about obedience of faith in my life? And what does that mean? And where is unbelief or unfaith present in my life? Where am I disbelieving? And where am I disobeying? I remember early on we had some hard news and some unexpected news. I've shared this kind of before with many of you, but with our son going through some tests, and it was early on. We had lots of questions and lots of fears, and the elders were coming over to pray, and the prayer of my wife and I was that we would be able to actually just obey Jesus, who said, "Don't worry about tomorrow." But what if the test is coming back Thursday? What if it says this? Don't worry about tomorrow. Easier said than done. But to bring ourselves about to the obedience of faith to say, who is God? What has he said about himself? What has he said about his future? I don't know what the future holds, but I do know the one that holds it. And I'm going to trust him. So I hope all of you are conscious of that in your own life and thinking about that as we look through this letter, not only today, but in the days to come. And I hope that you share what you're learning with one another. I've always loved how Paul says, I've longed to see you. I've longed to come to Rome. I'm the apostle. I'm preaching. I'm teaching. I've got the mic, so to speak. He says, but not just that I can impart something to you because I think that you need to listen to me, but he says that we might be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. So I might have an opportunity to speak now and again, or I might be in a position where more people listen to what I say, but I'm convicted here that I need to be in a position where I listen to more people than I speak to. Because as I find my life marked by various points of disobedience that are at their root unbelief, unfaith, faithlessness, that I need other people's faith to speak into mine so that I might have that faith rekindled. Like the journeymen on the road to Emmaus, when Jesus opened the word to them and they were hopeless and despairing, and then their hearts were kindled within them as he opened the scriptures to them and spoke hope and life and faith into them. We need that from one another, not just on Sunday morning, but especially on Monday morning. I joke with my colleagues who I work with. The great thing about Monday is it only comes once a week. So, what we're going to, the premise by which we're going to operate from is that obedience that flows from faith is what leads to flourishing. And that God's ways are better than ours, and that when we orient our lives around His, it leads to flourishing. Not that it's easy. The Christian life isn't easy. But it does lead to life. And it does lead to flourishing. And so right in the middle of this introduction to those concepts and those ideas and those presuppositions, Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And he wants to, the thing about this is that he says, I long to see you that I might impart some gift to you. He wants to preach the gospel among them. And he says, but since I can't be there, I'm just going to preach it through this letter. And we have the longest, most thorough exposition of Paul's understanding of the gospel in all of Scripture. And he says, because I'm not ashamed of it, because the gospel, which we're going to explore this whole series examining what is that. But the good news of Jesus is the power of God for salvation to all those who have faith. Who have faith in it. And the righteous shall live by faith, he says, as it's written. And I don't have time this morning because of the condensed context, but if you go read Habakkuk, I would just encourage you, anytime an Old Testament passage is referenced here, don't just look at the verse, go look at the book, go look at the chapter, go look at the context in which that verse is taken, because the assumption is that you understand that. So if I started singing Amazing Grace, which I'll spare you from, but if I started singing Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, many of you would know the next line, right? You understand the context of that whole song. It's not just that one verse that you're aware of, that you're considering. It's the whole theme of that song. And maybe some of you even understand the whole story of how that song was written and what the author was going through and the great loss that he was suffering, right? Or that all the pain that his hands and his livelihood had caused, right? But here in Habakkuk, the righteous shall live by faith. It's a whole argument about trusting God in the midst of something that doesn't make sense, i.e. that he would use the ungodly to bring about righteousness. And Habakkuk is like, I don't know about this. And God says, you can trust me. Don't look around you, look up. Don't put your faith in your circumstances. Don't judge a book by its cover. Do all the cliches, right? Just whatever makes you remember. But that's the context of the whole book of Habakkuk in which this faith is. God says, I'm not saying this like it's a little easy thing that you can put on your coffee mug and sip in the morning and it makes it all easy and it's nice. You have this quiet time to yourself and everything's peaceful and the kids aren't up yet and you know no one's called from work yet and you're just enjoying The righteous shall live by faith. That's not the context in which God says that. It's, I'm in the midst of pain and suffering. People around me are dying. The culture and the nation and everything around me says this is the definition of the fall. This is not human flourishing. This is human suffering. It's in the midst of that God says, trust me. Because that's when you need to trust him. And he's going to say, but the gospel is the power of salvation. If it's good news, here's another question for you as we walk through the book. If the gospel is good news, it should be good news for all the bad news in your life. So whatever the bad news is, the question should be, how does the gospel speak to this? How does this save me from this? I remember the pastor Tim Keller once shared that he had a girl in high school who said she had all the doctrine down, right? She had the gospel down. She had all the truths of God and his grace and his love down. But she said, but what good is that if nobody will ask you to the prom? There's an honest question in a girl who's willing to wrestle with it. What does the gospel have to do with this? What I feel, the frustration that I feel in this situation, the rejection I feel, the loneliness I feel, all of those things. Paul's inviting us to take all of our questions and bring them before the Lord. And he says, and if we do that, then we experience the righteousness of God. And he opens up with two apocalypses, the Greek word. The revelation, we call it the revelation. And there's two revelations introduced here. The righteousness of God revealed to those who live by faith, and the wrath of God for those who don't. God reveals reality. He pulls back the curtain and allows us to see that if we trust him, despite what we see here behind the curtain, if we trust him with what's in front of us, that when all is revealed, he will be proven trustworthy. But if we don't, the unrighteousness, living by this definition, it's not just that do deeds that aren't right. It's deeds that are born out of unbelief, that are not done in faith. Living by what we see, right? And when we go, well, this looks like it's the right thing to do. This makes sense to me, and this is what everybody else is doing, and I don't see that there's anything wrong with that. And it doesn't line up with faith. God pulls back the curtain, and we get to see the ugly. We get to see the consequences. And that's why in the book of Proverbs, the admonition is, hey, the fool is the one who everyone who's kind of been there, done that, has the scars, has the wounds, and has suffered. The wise person is the one who learns from other people's suffering so that they don't have to go through it themselves. That they learn, they look at all of the other things that did not lead to flourishing, but that left to suffering and pain, whether it's relationally or financially, or all those who woke up their neighbor with a loud voice in the morning. And when the neighbors finally wake up on Saturday midday, it says it'll be a curse. I joke with my son, what are Saturdays for? Saturdays are for sleeping in. Right? That's a mantra in our house, right? Proverbs, he who greets his neighbor with a loud voice in the morning should be counted a curse by midday. That's when my other son wakes up at the crack of noon, you know. Paul's going to ask us he's going to say that God is going to reveal. Ultimately, he is going to reveal the consequence of faith and unbelief. Trust trust in who God is and trusting in ourselves. And he says the way that you see our path towards unbelief is by beginning with suppressing what we know. And what follows here is a very precise diagnosis of the human condition. He says, what can be known about God is plain. It's clear through what has been created. That what can be known is clearly seen. It can be understood. It's clearly seen. It's in plain sight. You don't need a revelation. You don't need an unveiling. It's right in front of you. It can be clearly perceived through what has been made so that they are without excuse. And so what he's going to say is that people who start down the path of unbelief have to suppress the obvious. It's clear, it's evident, it's common sense, which has become uncommon, but it's right in front of you. And for you to choose something different means that you have to suppress the obvious. So here we're not dealing with people who've never heard, so to speak. We're not dealing with people who haven't seen. We're dealing with people who know and suppress. The evidence isn't hidden. It's clearly perceived through creation. And it says, although they knew God, in other words, they understood right from wrong in a sense, or that which is natural versus that which is unnatural, that which is obvious, that which isn't. They didn't honor him as God or give thanks, but became futile in their thinking, and then their hearts were darkened. So there's this progression. Although they knew God, they didn't honor him or give thanks. So the root of this disorientation that he's going to address, or that we can find ourselves in when you've lost your way and you don't know right from wrong or up from down, or where you are or where you're going. He says the root of all of that disorientation is ingratitude. They knew God, but they didn't honor him, didn't give thanks. They became futile in their thinking. Their hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they were fools. Ingratitude leads you down that path. I call this teenager. Although they knew, they did not honor. They did not give thanks to the one who gave them breath. Then they became futile in their thinking. Their hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And Paul says we all have a tendency towards spiritual adolescence. We all have a tendency to think that we know better. And usually it's because we're not grateful for what we have, and we think that something else is going to bring us life, or lead to flourishing, or lead to happiness, or lead to fulfillment. And so because what I want, or when I want it, or the way I want to go doesn't line up with what I know and what's obvious, the only way to get there is to suppress the truth. And then we arrive then at the hinge of the whole chapter. They exchanged the truth for a lie. Maybe it's a lie that someone was told them. Maybe it's a lie they're telling themselves. I know for most people, but I'm different. In this situation, it's okay. It's not really that big of a deal. Did God really say? If you ever find yourself wrestling with those questions, you're on the precipice of exchanging the truth for a lie. And the reason that God, in his commandments, that's one of the commandments, don't lie, the reason is to each other and to yourself is because you need to make decisions based on reality. if you lie to a potential spouse about who you are and what you've done and where you believe, and you present yourself as something that you're not allowing them to make a decision based on the truth. The most loving thing that you can do is let people make decisions based on the truth. But when you exchange the truth of God for a lie, you're not only exchanging those things, you're actually, what he says is, what you're doing is you're worshiping something else. And that's why you do it. For most of us, it's I'm worshiping something else. I'm seeking to find meaning, fulfillment, happiness, joy, whatever it is, relief from this grief and this pain. What I believe that what's really going to ultimately be what I need is this and not this, and so I worship that. And I don't trust. And that's the central move of this passage, and actually it's going to set up the whole book. What has your affection will have your attention. And whatever has your attention will determine your direction, and your direction will determine your destination. Any of y'all here when we had the old bridges in Charleston from downtown into Mount, you took your life into your hand as you were driving over those. I remember coming from Texas, like, this bridge was not designed for a Texas-sized truck. It was designed for a horse and carriage, and I know it says 2 lanes, but that's just, that it's lying. It's not being truthful. And I remember when they started building the new bridges that were taller and bigger, and I'm just like enamored by this construction project that's going on in front of me as I'm driving down the road. And you notice what happens when you do that. When you start turning your attention, you start turning your direction, and your car kind of starts swerving towards where you're looking. That's what he's saying here. You have to be careful what captures your attention, what captures your affection, because your life can veer, and it may be subtle at first, but you can end up wrecking your life. Now, this isn't just on I told Steve I'd give him some history this morning. I don't know where Steve went, but I told him I'd give him some history this morning. If this isn't just individual, what I hope that you see is that this is cultural as well. This happens to societies. This happens to civilizations. This happens to countries. If Paul is right that this exchange doesn't just affect individuals, it affects entire cultures. And we should expect to see evidence of that if that's true. And so I'm going to talk to you about stuff that most of you probably didn't think was relevant when you were in high school and you studied history. You just needed some dates and some names, and it wasn't really, most of us, what are most of us thinking about in high school? I have no idea. But we weren't thinking about history. And we weren't really thinking about how, the theological implications that led to the revolution in France. But in the decades leading up to the French Revolution, the philosophers Voltaire and Rousseau and Diderot, they laid this intellectual foundation of suppressing the truth for a world without God. Voltaire ridiculed the church, and Rousseau reimagined a humanity that was built on the goodness of the individual, the inherently goodness of humanism. And they wanted to liberate humanity from the chains of religion and tradition. We didn't need redemption. We didn't need liberation or redemption from our sin. We just need liberation and redemption from religion. And Diderot compiled like an encyclopedia that to replace revelation with reason. And they constructed this framework where unaided human reason was sufficient to build a good society. And you had a whole society buy that lie and believe that. They exchanged the truth for a lie. God wasn't necessary. Not only did they think God was not necessary, he was the obstacle. In 1789, those ideas took to the streets. And by 1793, the revolution was marching into the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and they stripped it all of its Christian symbols, and they enthroned a prostitute from the streets on the altar as the goddess of reason. They renamed Notre Dame the Temple of Reason. They even created a new calendar to erase every trace of the Christian year. The kids of the 60s were nothing, man. But then, within months of that happening, the same revolutionaries who enthroned reason started erecting the guillotine. The reign of terror followed. Somewhere between 16 and 40,000 people were executed, and many of them were the actual revolutionaries who had started it. Robespierre, the architect of the new rational order, was himself dragged to the guillotine within a year. And the revolution that promised liberation had collapsed into chaos, only to be conquered by Napoleon, who would then drive Europe into darkness. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. It didn't lead in, the revolution didn't lead in some liberation, it led to the guillotine. And then in Germany, the example that everybody likes to use, right? A German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche, said when he surveyed the culture in Europe, God is dead. And we've killed him. What was plain was suppressed. Claiming to be wise, they became fools. And he wasn't mourning that, as some of us might when we hear that. He was celebrating it. He was announcing a new era. With God removed, Nietzsche argued humanity was free to create its own values. The weak, the meek, the merciful, they were symptoms of a slave morality inherited from Christianity. This was cultural evolution, where might makes right, and let the weak suffer the consequences. What was needed, he said, was the Übermensch in German. Some people translate that the Superman, the Overman. A man beyond our definitions of good and equal or evil, who would impose his will on the world and forge and dictate its meaning. Within a generation of those ideas, they found their most terrifying expression, as most of you know, through National Socialism. And Hitler did not misread Nietzsche. He applied him. A master race beyond conventional morality, the will to power as the highest virtue, might making right. This systematic elimination of those deemed to be unfit by his own definition. When you remove God, who says that every human being bears his image, you don't get a race of supermen. You get the Holocaust. God reveals, his wrath is revealed against those who practice unrighteousness. And it should terrify us when he does. 6 million Jews, million more in the wars and in the camps and in the trenches. One person said, instead of an Übermensch, it turned out to be an Untermensch. A man who had lost his humanity, was below being a human, not above it. They didn't become the realization of what it really means to be human. They lost it, like the story of Nebuchadnezzar, who's eating grass in the wilderness until he comes to his senses and praises God. Becomes like an animal, less than a human. Then you can look at Russia and you can look at China and their materialist utopias founded on another philosopher who rejected God and decided to go in a different direction. Remember, your direction will determine your destination. Where Nietzsche elevated the individual, Marx elevated the collective. He said religion is the opiate of the masses, a narcotic that dulled us and prevented us from really exploring and achieving our freedom. We were being exploited, he felt. And so the solution was this dialectic materialism, is just a philosophical term. But he wanted to strip away God, strip away private property, strip away institutions that perpetuated the old order, and build a new humanity built on the foundation of economic justice, economic equality. Not equality because you and I are made in the image of God. So the Bolsheviks made an exchange in 1917. The churches were demolished or converted. They were converted to warehouses to serve their God, right? Priests were executed, and the state declared officially, there is no God, like Nietzsche in Germany. And man would build, they launched on the great ambition and promise to the masses and to the people that they would build paradise on earth. The result, what Stalin, in conservative estimates, this is conservative estimates, placed the death toll at 20 million. The Gulag labor camps swallowed entire populations. The regime that began declaring humanity's supreme dignity ended by treating human beings as just raw material to be consumed by the state, disposable. In China, Mao's Cultural Revolution made the same exchange, the truth of God for a lie. Every trace of the old order, religious, cultural, familial, was going to be destroyed to make way for the new humanity. The great promise. The result was famine, mass execution, and a death toll that eclipses all the others combined, between 45 to upwards of 80 million people. The pattern is unmistakable. The preacher is replaced by the philosopher who rejects God in the mind, and then the revolutions enact that rejection in the streets. And those promised utopia descend into a darkness. And they can't even understand or orient themselves because they've thrown the compass away. Our country's headed in the same direction. We may have started at a different place, pointed in a different direction, but we have turned. One Russian pastor said that Russia is a nation in darkness looking for the light, and that America is a country in the light grasping for the darkness. I didn't put this quote up for you. Maybe we'll put it in the notes. Francis Schaeffer put it this way. He said, where there is no absolute to govern society, society is absolute. There's nothing magic about democracy, about government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It assumes that the majority of the voting public has the wisdom and character to place worthy men and women in authority. But if that society abandons its historic worldview, should it reject God and enthrone man, then absolute divine law will erode in each generation until the tyranny of the majority rules. And now, we're a country that's tossed to and fro, as Ephesians says, by human cunning and craftiness and deceitfulness, by every electoral promise. In every election cycle, we just elect a new tyranny or a new majority to exert tyranny. This isn't a left or right thing. Don't see me speaking to who's in power or who's in office and who was in office. I'm hopeful that you can actually see that this is bigger than our politics. But you shouldn't be surprised at what you see when God pulls back the curtain on a culture that rejects or makes the great exchange and worships things that can't bear the weight. All right, well, I've put it off long enough. When Paul describes this, the effects of this or the fruit of this exchange, he opens with an illustration. And he says, they were given up into the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. Therefore, he gave them up to dishonorable passions. And when he describes that, he says, their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error. This is why I pray that you would approach this text with me with faithfulness, but with carefulness. I'm not trying to make this a soapbox issue, though it is in our day. It's the passage that's in front of us. It's the passage that's here. I'm not going and trying to find this passage. In all honesty, I would like to not find this passage and preach on something else. But to be faithful, we have to deal with what he's saying. Now, it becomes me to explain a little bit of this because the opportunity affords itself. Because if you're going to be a church that kind of walks through books of the Bible, I mean, the church in Rome would have read all of Romans on Sunday. That would have been the sermon, right? They wouldn't have been looking at it for 9 months or 12 months and verse by verse, and they would meditate on it and that sort of thing. But this was the sermon, right? And so as a church that's taking that much time to go through letters, the likelihood that you're actually going to come across one of these passages that deals with this particular issue on a particular given Sunday is like maybe once every 10 years, maybe. Because what you should know about this issue, and I'm just going to take this opportunity to kind of put this before you, is that there's only 5 passages that address homosexuality explicitly in the Bible. There's only 5. There's 2 in Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13, if you want to write them down. Now, as soon as you say Leviticus, immediately you're going to get, well, that was cultural or ceremonial, and you're saying I can't eat seafood or wear mixed blend shirts, right? That's often the retort. Anything from Leviticus is just off limits or not appropriate to talk about. I'll simply just tell you for sake of time that those prohibitions in Leviticus, those 2 passages, are part of what's called a holiness code. It has nothing to do with ceremony, has nothing to do with dietary. It has to do with holiness in a moral sense. And those prohibitions sit alongside other prohibitions which should naturally seem evident. Through what has been created, it's evident that some things are natural and some things are unnatural. And those prohibitions sit alongside inappropriate relations between parents and children in this area, inappropriate relationships between people who are not married with other people's spouses and other people's husbands and other people's wives, and inappropriate relationships with animals. It's like, well, those are kind of cultural things. It's supposed to be, with animals, it's supposed to be obvious. That's the context. The whole context is there are natural relations and there are unnatural relations. And just as relations with an animal or with your own child or someone else's spouse, that's not okay, this is not okay. That's the list that it's in. It's not in some isolation by itself. It's meant to be shown as an example of several different areas of life in which this is not the created order and intent by which we're supposed to live. That's the only 2 times in the Old Testament, explicitly with instruction about this issue. There are 2 times in the New Testament where it's listed again in a list of other issues. You can look it up for yourself. 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Timothy 1. But like here in Romans, it's listed among universally recognized moral violations. Theft, perjury, greed, slander. It's listed amongst other things. And I believe what Paul is doing here and why he starts with it here is because all of those other things are the things that we tend to not see as problematic. And he's actually not trying to elevate this issue of homosexuality as the pinnacle. He's trying to say, of all of this list, this is the most naturally obvious. This truth that he's saying is like, this is naturally obvious. But when you do the other things that he says that we ought not do on social media, when we gossip, when we slander, when we hate, when we're insolent, we're haughty, and we're boastful, those are really easy to make excuses about. Because it's not as obvious, right? So we can slander people, we can say hateful things about people, but that's why James in his letter says, hey, your mouth was meant to bless and not curse. That's like drinking filthy water. That's not natural. That's not the natural way in which God gave us language to communicate, was to tear one another down. It was given that we might build one another up. James takes that as that should be obvious, what your mouth was made for. But Paul, that's why Paul puts it in this list as first, is like, oh yeah, you got me there. That seems like I can see by what's been created physically and biologically why that's not appropriate between men and men, women and women, men and animals, etc. And while that's obvious, these other things are also evidence that we have lost our humanity. When we treat each other the way that he lists here. And then he ends the verse, or he ends it by saying, not only did they know that they shouldn't do that, they found themselves actually approving those who practice it. And so now when I have somebody who's got a megaphone that's echoing my slander, but on their platform, and it's hitting a bunch of people at a bunch of time, and they're fighting back with my voice, I'm cheering them on. And Paul is trying to say, when you see this happening in a culture, in a society, they've lost their humanity. And so, again, I'm not trying to give too much attention to this particular issue, although some people will try to make that be the quintessential issue. That's not really the quintessential issue that Paul's trying to address. He's trying to address the quintessential issue, which is when you exchange the truth of God for a lie, unfaithfulness for faithfulness, it has impact, it has waves, and we lose our humanity. Or, in theological terms, we no longer bear the image of God. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us valuable. That's what makes us beautiful. Caleb, I went over by a lot. What I want to, I'll conclude quickly for you just to let you know that as we move through all the chapters in Romans, he's going to deal with different ways in which people make this exchange. Chapters 3 and 4, we're going to talk about those who by works through the exchange of trying to achieve. 5 and 8, you're going to talk about people who strive and work. Again, what you should do as you read through it is say, where's the exchange happening, and how does the truth of God as revealed through Jesus speak to this and free us from this, making this mistake? And all of this is going to culminate in Romans chapter 12, or actually Romans 3, or Romans 11:39, right before Romans 12. Those aren't inspired verses, so the real culmination is what we sang this morning. You notice that there's a transition between this disorientation that happens in the book of Romans. So in Romans 1, he says, when you make this exchange in the wrong way, your bodies are dishonored, there's false worship, futile thinking, a debased mind with no discernment, given over to our passions. In Romans 12, it says, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, that you may discern the will of God. Renew your mind. And how do you use your body to serve one another? That's what Russ was saying that we're going to spend an extended period of time looking at. It's a reorientation. Paul reorients people from Romans 1 to Romans 12. Bodies as living sacrifices, true worship with renewed minds, able to discern good. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory. That's what we sang this morning. And then he appeals to us on the basis of mercy to respond differently. How does someone get from Romans 1 to Romans 12? It's not a trick question, kids. Romans 2 through 11. The only thing that can reorient us is the gospel, is to have our affections and our hearts renewed by the truth of who God is, what he's done, what love looks like, what forgiveness looks like, what mercy looks like. And then when we have our hearts, affections, and minds renewed and in view of mercy, right, your attention and your affection and your direction are changed. Now I'm looking at mercy. So that's what we're going to get the privilege of looking at over the next weeks and months together. So I started with a painting. I'm going to end with a painting. I want to give you a different painting, a picture of a different embrace. Whose worth and worship is not superficial in the gold, but in the substance of what's presented. Most of you probably don't know who that is in the picture, either one of them actually. That is Rembrandt painting himself and his wife. I don't know if she would consider this flattering because the title of the painting is The Prodigal in the Brothel. I mean, he's calling himself the prodigal. I don't know what he's calling his wife. Rembrandt painted himself in over 80 different pictures and paintings and sketches. He wrote himself into his own work often. In many ways, this is he's celebrating what Klimt celebrated, right? And this painting is enormous. It's like over 8 feet tall. So this painting, this is where Rembrandt starts in life. But he ended his life with a different perspective. This next painting is this is for Jay Printer. Not because I think he's a prodigal, but because he pointed me to a book that talks about this painting particularly. Out of the darkness, light. This doesn't have the whole picture, but the rest of the picture, it's like all dark, and this is what the light is shining on. It's not a superficial gold flake like in the kiss between the lovers, but I would argue its light is more beautiful. It shines because of what you see, the compassion, the mercy, and how Rembrandt saw himself. The son is on his knees, head pressed against his father's chest. His clothes are ruined, tattered, as if someone who spent everything out in the far country and has left nothing left to bring. One of his sandals has fallen off. It's not beautiful, it's not gilded. It's just a picture of brokenness and mercy. The father's hands are on him. Everyone notices, one of the things that they notice in the picture is just how big the father's hands look proportionately. They're not grasping each other. They're not pulling. They're simply receiving. They're blessing. And if you know the story, he is clothed in glory, like the others. Though you don't see it initially, it may look like, but when you pull back the curtain, he's clothed in glory. He's given a robe. He's given a ring. They have a Thanksgiving meal. So do you see the contrast? Two types of embrace. In Klimt, they're two equals kneeling together. A creature turns another creature, and the gold is everywhere. It looks like this is glorious, but it's glory borrowed from icons and given to the erotic. In Rembrandt's painting, the gold is almost gone. And as I mentioned, what light there is falls not on the glamour and the sensual and the exciting of a new relationship or passion, but on mercy. Rembrandt, the prodigal in the brothel, and the prodigal comes home. That's going to be Paul's intent for us as we look through Romans, is what we're going to realize is that we've all been the prodigal. And this isn't a once-in-a-lifetime thing where at one time in my life I went off, but then I've come back, but this is a daily thing. Some of you may wander and find yourselves as a prodigal on the way to lunch. But Paul's going to say, you're always welcome to come home. And when you do, you won't just find the Father that loves you, waiting to receive you, waiting to restore you, but also waiting to return you to your humanity and to bestow his image upon you, that you might be an image of God again in this world. Let's pray. Father, thank you for opportunity to spend time considering the ways in which we need direction. I pray that you would give us eyes to see the ways in which we've deceived ourselves, the ways in which we've believed lies. Give us ears to hear the truth. Turn our attention towards the things that are truly worthy, that our lives might be directed towards your glory and our good, not just for the good of our own lives, but for the good of the lives of those around us, those who we love, the country, the culture, the world in which we live. And to you and through you and from you be all the glory. Amen.